Well, hey, what's up, everybody? Matthew here. Did I ever tell you about the time that George Whitefield got in a fist fight with Jonathan Edwards after church by the church bell out in the yard, all the congregation watching? All right, well, it wasn't exactly like that. In fact, that's not what happened at all. But there was a couple of moments where Jonathan Edwards got sideways with his friend George Whitefield. I'm going to tell you about it in just a moment. If you're new to this channel, my name is Matthew. I am one of the pastors here at Gospel Fellowship PCA. We are a Reformed Bible-believing church just north of Pittsburgh. If you're looking for a church like that, come check us out. All right, well, I got lots of Jonathan Edwards videos on this particular channel. He has been my study interest for more than a decade or so now. And one of the things that I love to do is to read Jonathan Edwards' letters, which you can read in volume 16 of the works of Jonathan Edwards, which you can either buy in hardback, and I happen to have one right here. Very expensive, though, or you can read it all for free on edwards.yale.edu. So you can go get everything Edwards ever wrote for free, edwards.yale.edu. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the relationship between George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards first, and then I'll tell you about the couple of times they got a little bit sketchy with each other. So Edwards, of course, was the diagnostician of the revivals. Edwards' local congregation had experienced revival in 1735, and the Great Awakening spilled out across all of the colonies in 1740 to 42. Jonathan Edwards was a local church pastor, the pastor of the Northampton congregation. Not only had his own area experienced great amounts of revival and joy and conversions and things like that, but he was also one of the first people to really write about what was happening during the revivals. And we think here especially of a couple different pieces. First, his A Faithful Narrative, 1735, which tells the story of the local revival. Second, we think of his Distinguishing Marks of a Work of the Holy Spirit, a wonderful little book. Definitely encourage you to read that one. It's about 35, 40 pages, something like that. And then there's also his Some Thoughts on the Revival, which was a little bit later as he's looking at the more broad revival. And then, of course, his Religious Affection, 1746, which kind of looks back on it post de facto. Okay, so Jonathan Edwards, not only was he a revival preacher, he did a little bit of itineration, going from church to church, as for instance, his preaching of sinners in the hands of an angry God. But primarily he's known in the Great Awakening period for being the one to really kind of discern what is actually happening in the revival, what is good, what is bad, what is legitimate, what is probably human manipulation. And all people, or most people would say that Edwards did a very good job of really discerning what truly is a work of the Holy Spirit as over against some of the elaborate manifestations, kind of the enthusiastic, getting carried away type of things that happened during the time of revival. So Edwards became known for his work in revival, especially when that first work, A Faithful Narrative, was printed in Europe, and then he kind of became the de facto expert on revival and revivalism at that time. Now, George Whitefield, totally different background. Edwards was a Congregationalist Calvinist, and Whitefield was an Anglican Calvinist, so they had theology in common for the most part, though I could probably say that a lot of Congregationalists in the colonies were largely suspicious of the Anglican Church of England. But nevertheless, they had such a theological affinity for the doctrines of grace that Edwards and Whitefield should have been and were perfectly suited for teaming up. In fact, one of those interesting letters that you can read about Edwards and Whitefield's relationship was the letter in which Jonathan Edwards invites George Whitefield to come to his congregation and to preach. He says, if you're going to be in the area, it's not too much farther to kind of swing around and come to Northampton, so please come to my congregation and preach. Now, let me set this up a little bit here before we talk about their controversy, because in those days, if you would have asked anyone at all, Whitefield would by far be the brighter star as far as his international reputation and appeal to a broad audience. Whitefield had the flair. He was the dramatic rhetorician or orator. He was one who preached with a huge booming voice. He could preach to thousands of people at a time. He clearly had God-given and trained vocal talent as far as his manner of preaching. He preached outdoors, he preached to coal miners, he preached out in the field. All these things were kind of innovations back in that day. And so Whitefield was the star attraction. People came from miles and miles away to hear him preach. If you were to compare, today we might think of Edwards and Whitefield as pretty comparable people. In those days, though, no question about it, George Whitefield was the star and Edwards was just some kind of local pastor who wrote a couple of good books, okay? Edwards did not have that drawing, magnanimous personality that Whitefield obviously had. So Edwards writes a letter to Whitefield, and he invites him to come to his house, and he does, and he stays, and he preaches to Northampton. And Edwards, as Whitefield is preaching, is moved to tears. He weeps the entire time that Whitefield is preaching. Whitefield also comes to the Edwards' house, and he preaches a couple of private lessons or family devotions with a few other special invitees, perhaps. And Edwards is so compelled by all this that he actually writes again and says that he was pretty convinced that his children, some of his children, were savingly wrought upon. In other words, Edwards points the conversion of his kids to the time that George Whitefield came over and stayed and preached in their church. So they had a wonderful relationship for the most part, though Whitefield primarily knew Edwards by way of correspondence in those stays at his house. But Whitefield probably had far more international contacts. He was moving about, gathering huge crowds everywhere he went, whereas Edwards, though he did do some itineration and was well known for some of his writings, never had that kind of personality pull that Whitefield would have had. Now, let's get into the couple of times that they got sideways with each other briefly, although they always said wonderful things about each other in public. For instance, George Whitefield said that when he stayed with Jonathan and Sarah Edwards, that they were the sweetest Christian couple that he'd ever seen, and actually inspired him to want to get married himself, because Whitefield was a single guy at that time. And Edwards would always defend Whitefield publicly for the most part, except for on 2 points. And here is the fight between Edwards and Whitefield. First, Whitefield had a certain knack for going around and accusing other people, other pastors, of not being converted. Now, this is kind of a little trope that he picked up either from or passed it to the Tennant family, Gilbert Tennant and his family, who were Presbyterian ministers. Whitefield did a very good job of working across denominations. Some churches refused to have him in their congregation. Others readily invited him to come. Whitefield did a very good job of crossing denominations in a time when people didn't really do that, especially as you had colonial congregational distrust of the Church of England. And so nevertheless, he was able to breach some of those lines. Well, he would very often accuse other ministers of not truly being converted, especially if they weren't caught up in the same kind of revival fires that Whitefield obviously encouraged and preached himself. And so that would certainly get awkward when you would come to town or swing through town and you would casually make reference to the fact that there is a lot of unconverted clergy, pastors that aren't saved, basically what he's saying. And you can imagine that using that kind of language would certainly win you a few enemies as well as a few friends. Of course, on the side of the revival, people are going to like that kind of language because it's spicy and fiery. On the other side, though, just because somebody doesn't have a magnanimous personality and maybe their preaching is a little bit more dry and maybe they're not seeing great results, you have no valid reason to accuse them of being unsaved on that point, right? And so Edwards was always very, very careful about thinking through issues of salvation himself, especially as his own father was a little bit skeptical of Edwards' salvation, because Edwards didn't go through those same kind of morphology of Puritan steps in order to be able to testify to his salvation in just the right way as his father and others would have expected. So Edwards is a little bit more careful, cautious when it comes to speaking of other people's salvation, knowing the tumult he had in his own heart related to his own conversion. So Edwards did not like the casual manner in which Whitefield would speak of unconverted clergy, and he told him about it face to face one time when they were either walking or traversing together. And Edwards records the fact that Whitefield was pretty dismissive when it came to that particular critique. Edwards writes something in another letter to the effect that Whitefield didn't want to talk about it much, which is a way of kind of saying he basically blew me off. I tried to speak a word of wisdom and discernment to maybe say, hey, tone it down on the those pastors aren't saved language, and maybe just be a little bit more cautious about thinking through these issues, especially in speech. Whitefield would think through some of these issues carefully, especially if you look at Whitefield's diary. He himself would admit that his early diary entries were kind of obnoxiously arrogant. Whitefield often thought of himself maybe a little bit too highly, as many of us are prone to do. I've been guilty of that. You've probably been guilty of that too, especially when the Lord brings success into your life. And that's a real warning and a danger there, isn't it? That whenever God actually gives us wonderful results in our ministry, we tend to start to think that we walk on air just a little bit. And as you're reading through some of George Whitefield's old diary entries, you can kind of sense that a little bit. And Edwards tried to call him back on it. And I think it worked a little bit, because George Whitefield does seem to have a little bit more misgivings about the way he so casually spoke of the Lord's leading and things like that. So the first issue that Edwards had with Whitefield was speaking too casually about unconverted pastors, maybe even assuming or attributing non-conversion to particular individuals. Edwards did not like that. Now, the other thing that Edwards called out Whitefield about was the idea of impulses. Now, today we would probably call that, with today's charismatic movement, words of knowledge or something like that. Or I guess that's what they call it, and I'm not a charismatic myself. But it's the idea that the Lord impresses in your mind kind of a picture or kind of an impression of something, or you feel that the Lord has directly spoken to you in certain ways, maybe to go over here and do this, go over there and do that, say this to a certain person. And so Whitefield had begun to speak like that a bit more than Edwards was comfortable with, this idea of the Lord told me to say this, or the Lord gave me this impression to speak this word. Edwards, if you really read his stuff, while he comes across as a bit of a fence sitter in some ways, it's actually just a real careful discernment that Edwards has. And he would usually classify that kind of thing as no certain sign either way, rather than saying, yes, the Lord has given you this impression, or no, the Lord has done no such thing, and I know it and you don't. But Edwards would often speak of those kinds of things as no certain signs, especially like in the religious affections, so check that out. But Whitefield had begun to say a lot more casually, the Lord has led me to do this, and the Lord has told me to do that. And that too put them a little bit at odds with one another, so much so that Edwards would later say, again in one of his letters here in this particular book, that Whitefield would be friendly to him thereafter, but never counted him as one of his intimates. In other words, Whitefield would always be charitable in speech about Jonathan Edwards, as Edwards would always respect Whitefield. You do get the idea that Edwards looks up to Whitefield in his letters and the way that he talks to Whitefield. Edwards is the one kind of looking up in this relationship. They would always be charitable with each other, but at that point, their relationship does seem to be a little bit strained from there on out. And again, as Edwards says, Whitefield would always be kind to him in speech and otherwise, but he never really brought him into his inner circle of best buddies. In fact, kind of interestingly, Whitefield would actually bring Ben Franklin into his inner circle of best buddies, which is kind of interesting because Franklin was certainly not any kind of evangelical Christian. Now, there's one more place in which Edwards and Whitefield got a little bit awkward with each other, and this one wasn't either their fault. So enter a third person into the scene called Thomas Clapp. Now, he is the rector of Yale, but in 1744, Thomas Clapp is speaking at Harvard. I'm not exactly sure how that happened, since those schools had a little bit of animosity with each other. But Thomas Clapp, another minister, he gets up and in public, in front of a large audience, he says, Edwards told me that Whitefield said that he's going to replace many of the ministers here in New England with real born-again, fire-preaching pastors from Scotland and Ireland and England. Okay, so a little bit of hearsay here. Thomas Clapp just says it publicly. And Edwards is absolutely shocked and horrified and appalled for two reasons. First, that Thomas Clapp would dare to say something public like that. But second of all, because Edwards says, I never said any such thing. So again, the idea here is that Whitefield, in his zeal to ferret out the unconverted clergy and to bring in true born-again, fiery preachers from Europe, that would be deeply unsettling to people here in the colonies or the Americas, because again, a lot of people are even skeptical about what's happening in the revival. And the idea that this Whitefield guy, with all of his fame and popularity, he's going to come and he's going to replace all the pastors that we know and love, well, that's just intolerable. So Edwards has to go into battle with Thomas Clapp. Okay. He does it first privately. He comes to him and he says, "Hey, I can't believe," I'm paraphrasing, "I can't believe you said that publicly. Why did you say it publicly? And when did I ever tell you anything like that at all?" Well, Thomas Clapp then begins a pamphlet war with Jonathan Edwards, in which they begin writing back and forth against each other. Edwards now has to vindicate and defend the fact that, first of all, he didn't say that, and he's deeply embarrassed that he might have brought some tarnish to George Whitefield's reputation. And so basically what they do is they write tracts and publish them back and forth, which was kind of a common thing in those days. No Twitter, no Facebook. They would just kind of go at it in pamphlets. And Edwards is obviously really trying to minimize any relationship damage that he might have sustained with George Whitefield, because certainly if that were true, it would be a major breach of trust between Edwards and Whitefield. Edwards ends up acknowledging something like this: "If I said anything even remotely close to that, I certainly would not have intended it to go public. But moreover, Whitefield himself never said anything like that to me, and if he did, I certainly wouldn't have told it to you." So that's kind of how it ends up. And again, you can read all of this correspondence, these back and forth between Edwards and Thomas Clapp in volume 16 of the works of Jonathan Edwards. All right, so that is the tension between Edwards and Whitefield. For the most part, they were very good friends and they worked together charitably. But they did have those 3 moments of awkwardness between each other. Whitefield's greater tension was probably with the Wesleys, with whom he also debated about predestination. At least he would have agreed with Edwards on that particular point, not so much with the Wesleys, though. All right, well, that's all I've got for you today, except for one little piece of information that I want to share. I do have a new edition of my dissertation on Edwards and Joy coming out on November 7th. It's called A Theology of Joy. What is the subtitle? I forgot. Jonathan Edwards and Eternal Happiness in the Holy Trinity. That's the name of it. I wrote it. I should know that. This is the same book that had already been out with a different publisher in times past. So if you've already read my dissertation, you do not need to get this book. Okay, so please don't buy a different cover and say, "Oh my goodness, I've already read this." But I did include in this second publication of my dissertation on joy a bunch of other things that I've also published on Jonathan Edwards online. So there's a volume 2 kind of in the back of this, in which I put together a lot of essays and articles that I've written. So if you haven't read my dissertation on Edwards and Joy, starting on November 7th, that's going to be a great time to go ahead and pick that up. Okay? Well, thanks for checking into this particular video. I do love you lots, and we'll talk to you later.